Welcome back. Today we're going to take a look at the CCA Lyra. And before we actually jump into it, this is becoming a little customary thing with KZ. The next set actually arrived before I got a chance to review Lyra, so here we go. So this is going to be the brand new KZ AS16 Pro, and this is the 8BA model, sort of reminiscent of the original, but with this actually faceplate pattern is very similar, or sort of similar to what we're going to see on Lyra in 1 minute. But as you can see, it is a professional hi-fi 8BA, and on the back you can sort of see lots of BAs in there, and they tend to run the sound into this 3D printed white inset, which is that, and that's very reminiscent of what they did on ASX and AST. So those of you wondering what set was next from KZ, that is it. And it's almost listed on a store right now, but not quite. Maybe by the time this gets published, there will be a listing for that. But it arrived today, so there you go. So back to the Lyra. So here is what the faceplate looks like on Lyra. It is actually a very nice faceplate. So instead of a triangular pattern, it's more of a hexagon pattern. And on the back, on the side, you can see it says CCA Lyra. And what's actually unique about Lyra is that this is the return of the XUN driver. And the XUN driver is KZ's special dynamic driver and housing. And what was new on this one is how people used to recognize the old XUN driver was that there was a little hat on top of the dynamic driver. It was sort of a tapered hat-looking thing. And they've basically shrunk the whole thing down to a very, very slim profile where you can almost not see it now. So that was what was new about Lyra. New driver, hasn't been used before. So that was why there was a lot of excitement around this model in particular. If you're a box watcher like me and you tend to notice when KZ uses color graphics and when they don't, you'll see that this one is black and white, which always makes me a little skeptical, but we'll go with it. So here we are, CCA Lyra. It is a one dynamic driver, and as I said, it is the new XUN driver, sort of the return of that model into a single dynamic driver, which is new because previously the only single XUN driver was the TWS model, the Z1. So this one is actually a little special model for fans who have been following KZ for a while. For that simple reason, it's essentially the second single XUN driver model ever for KZ. So kudos to them for finally putting that out because lots of people have asked for it. So as I said, new driver, new refinement on the recent tuning. It's not all that far from some of the recent models that have come out previously. So I did ask about this driver, and I said, is this, has the driver itself been used before? Is it brand new? And the answer was, no, it's a new driver, but it hasn't been used in another set yet. So for those of you following along, you'll probably see the same driver used again in a different set, perhaps branded by KZ. Not sure yet, but sounds like we will definitely see a return of this driver, so looking forward to that. So the sort of too long, did not watch, read through all of my notes kind of statement on this set. It's actually a quite nice set, but almost like the ESX, I will say it doesn't quite measure up to the EDA Trio. I think that was sort of the recent top-of-the-line pinnacle for KZ as far as giving people three IEMs that are actually pretty solid, and the balance and the high res are actually very, very nice. And for the same reason that I said this about ESX, where ESX didn't quite topple the King EDA either, it's on the mids, and I think this one, again, doesn't quite topple EDA for the same exact reason. So jumping into it, 2 steps forward, 1 step backwards. So from a purely playback perspective of does you hit play on Spotify, does the track sound like the track? Yeah, it actually does pretty well. It's a really good set, and there's just a couple trade-offs on what they did with the new signature. And again, it's sort of hard to recognize this as a KZ, a past KZ set from the graph or the sound. So let's sort of take a look at what these new recent KZ models look like on paper, on the graph. So like I was talking about, you've got KZ EDA balanced in red, and ESX in blue, and the new Lyra in green. So bass-wise, it's a hair down from ESX, which I think was a brilliant move. One of my concerns about ESX was simply that it should have been brought down 1 or 2 decibels. A really, really small change would have made a big difference, simply because ESX had a lower 2 to 5K range, and they didn't really need to bring this up anymore because this was already dropped down a little bit. So that was ESX. For EDA balanced, it basically has just about the same bass level as Lyra, and I actually like this bass level. I like this bass level on Lyra quite a bit. Unbalanced, it sounded maybe a little heavy, but here it actually works a little better simply because of where Lyra's 2 to 5K range is. It's actually boosted above balanced and ESX. So it's this trade-off of you can get away with a little less bass, but you don't need to raise this 2 to 5K area like they did in Lyra. And balance sort of hit that middle ground, sort of dead on. Bring this 2K where it's a little in your face, bring that down a little bit so it's not shouty, it's not in your face, it's a very gentle rise. And then you could add a little, presence and detail a little later. So what Lyra does is essentially rise a little earlier, so it is a little more prominent right there in the lower treble, and then it carries over. It's just kind of a little higher version of the other two. So very much a trade-off. I sort of prefer where balanced was. I sort of love this bass level, and I love how they brought it across kind of lower and then raised it and then dropped it again. And I think that worked for, ironically, balanced, I think, was a very balanced set. And Lyra just tends to be just a little brighter because of that one area there. So we'll probably jump back to that graph in a little bit. But so I do like the bass on this one. Like I said, it's got lots of control, lots of speed. With the sort of 2 to 5K area the way it is, the bass is actually dropped down a little bit below the mids. It's very much almost a U shape, and you don't really hear any bass bloat or bleeding at all. It's quite controlled, nice speed, pretty good quality. But as far as a recent set that I didn't have to EQ the bass down, Lyra pretty much nailed that one. So treble, as I mentioned, it's just a hair high, and it pulls the mids slightly up, and it gives you sort of a more digital, not analog sounding tone, and combine that with some recessed mids, and this really wasn't my favorite mids, and I will take EDA balanced over this for this exact reason. They didn't need to pull these up any higher than they did. They should have dropped it back down where balanced was, and you would have had almost a sort of low-high balance in the vocals and the mids, and it sounds just a lot more natural. This one sort of comes across as a little sharper, a little more digital. For me, it's just not as pleasing as what EDA balanced did, so that's that. So the sound, as I mentioned, it is a U-shaped flavor variation on recent KZ releases. With the bass speed and the way it doesn't bleed into it, it very much sounds more like a U-shaped set. More so than previous releases because of that one reason. This one is a little more library dependent, and because of this area is raised a little more, so if you have tracks that tend to hit this a little harder, this is going to sound a little leaner because you don't have this extra bump to it. So I would say if your tracks or your library tends to be down in this area, this will sound very much like the previous releases. This won't really bother you as much, but the more that your track hits this area, and I really noticed it's just a little higher than it really should be, and this whole thing sounds just a bit leaner than it should for that reason. So I will say that this one definitely a little more library dependent, and be a little more careful with thinking about what your library looks like versus having something that's potentially a little leaner in the bass and raised up in that 2K area on the pinna gain is just going to sound just a little higher, a little brighter, a little leaner than some of the past releases. So bass, as I mentioned, is probably my favorite part, and I'm sort of glad that KZ chose that level. And the way they tuned it and sort of had all those bass control, there's almost no bleed. Quite a step forward in that way. It probably won't satisfy heavy bass fans, and certainly some genres probably could have used a little more bass. But as far as clean mids and not having the bass really intrude into the mids at all. I think they pretty much nailed that bit. But again, this is really a game of small decibel refinements on what KZ has been doing. And the bass does sound more controlled and cleaner against that gain level, but that's because the gain level is a little boosted from where it should be. So depending on where your library hits the bass, it can sound, versus the low treble, as I said, the Lyra can actually go from a slightly boosted bass sounding set to a slightly lean set. So do, again, be very aware of where your library sits in that range. So the mids. And sort of before we get into it, I will say that there is a person at KZ who tunes the mids in a way that doesn't pay as much attention to lower male vocals as I would prefer. And this person has sort of this signature sound where male vocals tend to be a lot higher than they really should be. And I will say that this one, it's very clean and it is slightly recessed more than the previous models, but it really has a hard time passing the Sam Smith, Eddie Vedder male vocalist test. For me, this one sort of ruined it right there. It really doesn't do lower male vocals. It does EDM and sort of higher end things very, very well. But as far as a full range, really feeling that emotional low end of the mids, this one sort of didn't really cut it. And the person who tuned this tuned a lot of sets more so last year, and I didn't like a lot of sets last year simply because they all had the same effect on the vocals, and those disappeared quite a bit from the EDA. You don't see it in EDA, you don't see it in ESX, even CRA Plus. All those had very natural vocals, especially on the male vocals. And this one sort of went back to where we were last year, and some nitpicks from me. So from a high-level view, this one, the playback is actually quite good. As far as I said, hitting a track and listening to it, it sounds actually quite good. But when you really dig deeper into it and listen to other recent releases, the texture and dynamics are just kind of off. It seems compressed and shifted. As I said, this tuning tends to shift everything a little higher than it really should be. So all your low bits where you're looking for that low end of Eddie Vedder's voice is sort of missing. And a lot of that is the emotion of his voice and the texture of his voice just kind of smoothed over and shifted where it shouldn't be. So I will say that this one, good playback, but it really lacked the emotional engagement for me anyway. Just my 2 cents on that. Treble-wise, as I said, there's a lower prominence to it, that 2 to 5K, especially at higher volumes, very much going to be the focus of the treble. And it's generally just slightly higher than ESX and EDA in that area. For me, I'm not a huge 5K fan. I sort of notice it right away, especially when you turn up the volume. You hit some cymbals or you hit some snare drums and it sort of pops right out of place, and that's what it does exactly on Lyra. The 8K, the one that's on the graph, it looks a little bigger than it is. The 8K and the sibilance on Lyra doesn't really bother me as much as the 5K did, especially at higher volume. But in general, I think they just got the balance off on the whole treble versus the bass on Lyra anyway. For the upper part of treble, it's a bit of the same issue as the mids. There is a presence, you're not lacking any treble, but as far as refinement and feeling like this sounds realistic or true to life, I think that part's sort of missing in the tuning as well. So stage, especially after you can EQ this, that 2 to 5K area, which is what I did, you can actually bring that down a little bit, and it does feel like there's more space. But typically this one pretty much sounds average for KZ recents, and average for KZ recents is actually quite good. So I'll say this one kind of fits along with the others. It's not all that far away, and I think KZ recently has really been setting the bar for this under $20 stage and separation. They've done just a really, really good job in 2022, really nailing that bit of it and making even budget affordable sets sound quite big, much, much bigger than they were even a year ago. So I will always give them props for that, because I think they actually do the stage actually quite well for the price of the set. The price of the performance, especially in that area, is quite off the chart. So that is my take on CCA Lyra. As I said, we'll hit the KZ AS16 Pro next. So again, thank you guys for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.